All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, JK, and we are kicking off a fitness and nutrition adjacent episode today. We are going to be talking about specifically how to train when you have an injury. And I'll give you some context in just a bit on where this particular question came from. First and foremost, though, as always, want to say thank you for choosing to press play on Help Me Understand. You certainly have no shortage of different podcasts that you can listen to and or watch if you might be watching this on YouTube. So I certainly never take it for granted that you chose to press play on Help Me Understand. So if you are newer to the Help Me Understand podcast, one episode per week is typically going to be focused on something within the realm of fitness and or nutrition and or specifically training or mindset around any combination of those things. So going forward, if you do have any particular suggestions or questions, because this particular episode was inspired by a question that I got in my Instagram DMs, if you do have a particular question that you would like me to answer, not only will I do my best to answer your specific question privately in the DMs, I also will likely provide some additional context because I still have yet to come across anyone who has asked me a question that someone else doesn't also have the same question. I'm not sure I just phrased that right. The long and short of it is rarely, so far, never has one person been the only one who's ever had that particular question. So welcome all training and fitness adjacent questions. So here's the question that I had gotten in my DMs. And first I have to give a shout out to Coach Ashley, who is one of our POP coaches. For those of you who are not familiar with some of the other work that I do besides one-on-one coaching, I also provide group programming for POP, which is Peak Optimization Performance. If you do have some interest in getting to know a bit more about what POP is able to offer, not only with Coach Ashley, but also a team of other very, very solid nutrition coaches, then just, again, hit me up in the DMs or you can email me in the show notes. We'll have my email. One of the things that I also do is I've been writing the POP training programs for a number of years now. So the way that things work with POP is that we are a nutrition coaching company and have a host of individual one-on-one nutrition coaches. We also have a group coaching program called POP Essentials. And then we have a very, very basic foundational training program, which is actually called POP Foundations, where you can access just simply a training program that I put out, and that is updated every 4 to 8 weeks. We actually just released the current 4-week cycle, and then after that is done, we'll jump into another 8-week cycle. So this question came from somebody who said, and I'll just go ahead and read it and we'll jump on into it. She said, "Hi, I worked with Coach Ashley for over a year, and now I am using your lifting programs and love them. I have arthritis in my knees from college knee injuries, so some movements like hip thrusts and lunges are very difficult to do. Will cutting out these types of movements impact my ability to have well-rounded workouts?" So I did respond to this particular one with a voice memo and gave her some very specific information based on the questions that she had. And I'll quickly recap with a couple of the pieces that were in this particular question, and I'll go more into detail on specific recommendations that I make if you are training with knee arthritis, knee injuries. I've worked with folks in the past who've had some meniscus issues that they are working through and have opted out of surgery and different things like that. I'll go through a general recommendation and then give you some specifics. And then also, one of the things that I mentioned to this particular person was that if they are finding that a movement, for example, like a hip thrust, is problematic or causing some sort of issues with the knees, this is a really solid example of where being able to get eyes on someone as they're performing the movement, whether that be having a trainer working with you in person or someone like myself who has clients that will send in videos of them doing the actual movement so that we can do a form check. That is where getting eyes on the movement itself, the person performing the movement, can be absolutely impactful, because generally a movement like a hip thrust should not be something that's causing or worsening any sort of a knee issue. when performed correctly, because it's such a glute and posterior chain focused movement. That's not to say that you don't have any engagement in the knee at all. It's just one of those things where, like, something like that versus something like a heels elevated squat, those should be two very different type of vibes as far as any sort of issues that it's causing with the knees. So that was one of the things that I responded with. And then the other thing that I talked about, and I'll go more in detail here, was I generally like to take the approach of, if you have an injury in a particular area, or if you've previously had issues in a particular area, and with this particular individual, they were talking about some knee arthritis. So not necessarily a specific like break or separation or overextension, like anything like that, just something that's going to be kind of lingering for a while. My strong recommendation is always to work on training what I call the supportive cast, and I'll get into that in just a minute. So training the muscles around that particular area. So things, for example, like if you're having a knee, some potential knee issues, then I recommend really focusing on training quads, hamstrings, glutes, and calves. And I'll talk about that more specifically. So that's just to start with how I generally answered that question, although I sent her a couple of voice memos with more specific. So that's just generally how I would answer that particular question. So let's get into just overall, let's talk about, if you've got a knee injury, some suggestions for you. I will start off with making sure that you are crystal clear that this does not replace any sort of medical advice that you have previously gotten, are currently getting, or should go seek out from someone who is able to diagnose and treat a particular injury or chronic issue that you may have. So that is my disclaimer here. This is not to override any sort of advice that you have been given by a doctor, a physical therapist, just anybody who's seen you in person. So hopefully you're getting my vibe there. What I do want to start off with is just letting you know that when it comes down to my approach is always going to be what I call lifestyle-centric. So I am always going to come from the aspect of a strong belief that fitness should work with your life, not against it. And just let's be, again, crystal clear about that. So I always start from a lifestyle-centric approach. So I'm going to try and get an understanding of other things that you have going on, other activities that you may have, where this particular issue is also affecting those areas of your life. I'm not a strong believer in, if you have a particular issue that you're working your way through, some additional soreness, some recovery from something, that you should just completely ignore doing anything to support that. And that's going to be point number one. So I've got basically three things that I jotted down here that we are going to call like some strategies that'll help you stay consistent and continue to build strength and protect your knee without making that particular injury worse. So the first one is, don't skip your training. Just make a shift and an adjustment and pivot what your focus is. So where this comes from is putting aside the actual, like the technical fact that there is an injury or something that we are working through. Putting that aside, first, let's address your mindset. And I want to make sure that that gets addressed first, because more often than not, there's this thought that, oh snap, well, now that I'm injured, that means I have to like stop doing everything. And that means all of a sudden I'm going to gain a bunch of weight and I probably shouldn't be eating as much. And we start going down this rabbit hole either immediately, or if that particular injury has not gotten any better, within a week or 2 weeks. You have a decent amount of folks that I've worked with who can kind of gut it out for a little bit, but then afterwards, like a week or two later, actual feelings, because we are humans here, as far as I know, have mostly humans, some humans with pets that are listening to this particular podcast. We're human and we have feelings. So it is very natural for that sort of like doom and gloom scenario to enter. And it doesn't mean that we all of a sudden have to decide that it's an all or nothing. It's like that example of, if you have one flat tire, you don't just take a knife and run around and puncture all the other three flat tires, or all the other three tires, and make those flat. So the first thing is reframe your injury mindset. So an injury doesn't mean stop, it simply means adjust. So something that I mentioned earlier is what I call training the supportive cast, or supporting cast. So if I think about something like a knee injury, I'm going to focus on ensuring that we have movements that are integrated into your program. So this is from the logistics standpoint. Let's put movements in your program that are going to address the supporting muscles around your knees. So things like your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings, so we'll hit posterior chain, and then also your calves. So there's different exercises that you can use for this. And again, as I mentioned in my disclaimer, this is something where I definitely would want this run by somebody who is treating you in person. If they have particular things that they've said, absolutely not, like don't do these particular things. What I will do for my clients, if they've come across something like this, whether it's a knee, a shoulder, a bicep, back, whatever it may be, is if they're seeing somebody in person, I will give them a list of different things that I'm considering putting into their program and have them run that by their person and let me know, hey, which of these are okay and which of them are a no-go. So things like glute bridges, clamshells, hamstring curls, whether it's like a seated leg curl or a lying leg curl. In some cases, if we're trying to really focus on the quads, things like a leg extension can still be something that can be done, again, depending on the severity of the knee issue that you've got and what you've been approved to do. But that's something that typically can be helpful. What I find more often than not is the things that people are typically being asked not to do when they have a knee injury are going to be things like squats, lunges, and sometimes step ups. I'd say with lunges, it typically tends to be like a forward lunge and then some squats. Those are like the main things that people will usually tell me, like, hey, these are the things that I typically eliminate from the program. And I understand that you're going to eliminate certain things for a period of time. My recommendation is always, okay, well, let's work on the things that surround that. So we may go more hard in the paint around like glutes, hamstrings, and calves specifically, if even the quads tend to be something that just become a bit more irritated, depending on where that knee issue is. And then I also will implement more core training. So remember that your core is not just your abdominals. Your core is essentially from right around the top of your pelvis up towards the top of your rib cage. So there's a pretty good amount of your body that needs to be strengthened. And when you are working on recovering from an injury, what you will find is it's very, very easy to, again, get into this mindset of like, well, I'm injured, so that means I can't really do much. And I'll get to some upper body stuff too here in just a minute. But that is what I tend to find seems to be one of the most challenging things for most people, is being able to stay focused on what you can do versus putting a whole bunch of energy into the things that at the moment you are not able to do. So the last thing that I'll say just about this bullet point with not skipping training and just being able to just shift and make an adjustment or a pivot is kind of think of it like you have something that from a foundational standpoint it needs some work, but think of it like you're working to try and patch and rebuild that foundation instead of just like up and moving and leaving out of the house, moving to a different neighborhood. All right, let's see here. So second suggestion that I've got for you is also looking at implementing some unilateral pieces and some isometric pieces. So when we say unilateral means single limb. So for the example of a knee injury, we're talking about single leg type movements. So it can be a single leg extension. Step up is going to be single leg for the most part, single leg hamstring curls and different things like that. The reason that we want to do things like that is to ensure that we are building balance. And also, what it does is it can help to identify some of the imbalances that we may have. Sometimes I've come across some instances where, with agreement with someone's in-person physician, or in most cases, like a physical therapy type setting, we've worked with a client to identify that they actually had been overcompensating. So say, for instance, in a squat, they had some stuff that was going on with their hips, which led to them overcompensating one leg more than the other. And then that's what eventually just straw that breaks the camel's back. And then they end up with an injury on one side of their body and not the other. So being able to make sure that we are working on some unilateral strength with things like split squats, single leg hip thrusts, single leg curls, those are all things that can be really, really helpful. I also like to, and I mentioned earlier, some core work. I like to do a lot of things hip mobility wise here too. This is a great opportunity if you are currently working through a knee injury to shift that focus where typically you maybe would have done like a heels elevated squat or something along those lines. Then we work on some hip mobility. And another little bonus tip that I will give is very regularly, if you are seeing someone who is treating you for an injury, whether it be a knee injury, shoulder, or otherwise, or ankle, think of that because I've gone through an ankle injury, they often will give you rehabilitation exercises to do. And if there is one thing that I have learned about humans, including myself, it is that for the most part, we really don't like to do the 5 minutes of mobility or the 5 minutes of rehab work. It's just really, we'd rather do anything but that. And this is where I try to use those things to our advantage, where it's like, okay, well, if you've been given 2 to 3 exercises by your PT to, then instead of just looking at it like, okay, I'm going to eliminate the squats or I'm going to eliminate the lunges, let's insert those movements that you've been given in place of the movements that you are moving out of the workout. So that's a very common tactic that I will use from a strategy standpoint, is if there is a movement that you're being asked to take out, then swap it with one of your rehabilitation movements. And that way you can integrate it and you don't feel like, well, now I'm just eliminating a whole bunch of stuff from the program and there's nothing to be put in its place. Then I also mentioned here, go unilateral, and then also training some isometrics. So isometrics are really good because they can really help to reduce joint strain and really start to build up some strength in those particular areas. So something like a wall sit, you can do a glute bridge hold, anything that's got some sort of like a tempo hold. So isometrics are essentially holds where you stay in a static stressed position for a while, but that stress is in a position where you're building up more and more strength. So one thing that I do want to make sure I do note is that if you are going to do isometric holds, like stay in the range that's still going to keep you pain free. So it's not like if going into a wall sit, if that's painful, I don't want you to just like sit there in pain. If going to a 90-degree angle with your legs puts you in pain, then don't go to 90. Let's go to, what would that be, like 75? Or higher, I'm sorry, like a 110 degree angle. I am no mathematician, but you know what I mean? Like don't slide all the way down the wall. Maybe you are halfway. And then as you begin to work up some additional strength, you begin to reduce the amount of pain, you find yourself able to sit down a little bit lower and lower till you can get to the 90-degree range. All right. The last key point that I've got here for you when it comes to strategies that you can use when you are working through a knee injury is don't forget that we've got all sorts of options as far as upper body workouts that we can do and all sorts of things that we can do from a cardio and conditioning standpoint, depending on the equipment and or environment that you have available to you. So keep in mind that if you're working through any sort of a lower body injury, you can still train your upper body hard AF, very hard. So you can definitely train the upper body pretty hard, your push-pull work. I mentioned core pieces already, but you can do some things that are a bit more like high intensity. If biking is okay, then certainly you can try and do something like that. But things like battle ropes, things like overhead ball slams, if you've got if you've got access to a ski erg machine, those can be fantastic. There are a lot of different options that you can play around with, as opposed to just being like, well, I guess I'm not going to be able to do anything to really get my heart rate up. Low key, if you can get access even temporarily as you're working through a knee issue, if you can get access to some sort of a recreation center, a community center, a YMCA, school setting, anything like that that has a pool, swimming or just kind of treading water in the pool can be an absolutely fantastic one. I don't think that one gets talked about quite as much. So getting somewhat creative with things that you can do from an upper body and a cardio / conditioning standpoint are always going to be really solid options. And really just keep in mind when it comes to this and all the other things that I've talked about, being able to maintain some consistency so that you can keep the momentum going are going to matter way more than you having like this absolutely perfect program that's going to nail absolutely everything, and understanding that yes, there are going to be certain things that are off limits for now. And one of the worst things you can do is try to rush things and try to just ignore the warning signs or what your doctor told you, or what if I'm your coach and I've told you, like, yeah, let's lay off this for a while and let's divert that energy elsewhere. When you're trying to push through that, typically what happens is when you rush to recover, you end up prolonging the recovery itself. So let's definitely not do that. All right. So just to go ahead and wrap this up. So 3 main things that I want to make sure you take away here from this particular episode when it comes to some strategies that you can use when you are training with a knee injury. So 1, make sure to train the supporting cast, quads, glutes, hamstrings, calves, not just woe is me over the knee. Okay. Number 2, implement some unilateral and some isometric training. So we talked about making sure also if you are implementing some isometric training or unilateral training, either or, make sure that you're staying within a range of motion that has you pain-free. And what you can do, again, is take any sort of movements that you've been given from a rehabilitation standpoint and sub those in to your program for the movements that you are currently not able to do. And then lastly, don't sleep on being able to, again, really go hard and pick up the intensity with your upper body movements, and also any sort of low impact, lower body type conditioning that you still can do. Try to get creative. Think a bit outside of the box, even if you don't currently belong to a gym that has a pool facility. Can you get access to one? So that can be something that's helpful. So I just want to remind you, the goal is to be able to train in a way that keeps you consistent and maintains momentum. Just because you are injured doesn't mean that you can no longer train. We're going to take that thing and we're just going to continue to keep the train going, pun intended. So just to close things out, if you are navigating through something like this, or if you know somebody who may be struggling with something like this, whether it's a knee injury or some other injury, I tried to do this in a way that addressed both the question that I was given and kind of put that out to the masses, along with taking these same points and you can transfer that to any other injury or any other sort of pains that you're working your way through. But if you know someone who you think this could be helpful to, go ahead and send them this episode. My goal is always to be able to provide some level of impact for those who listen to the podcast. So if you know someone, I would sincerely appreciate if you pass this along to them. All right, so with that, I am going to go ahead and close out this particular episode. So if you've stuck around this long, I sincerely appreciate you. So thank you for listening to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time.